Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the specifics of right-wing politics. This is a video I've wanted to do for a while and someone recommended it to me last week, so I figured I'd get to work on it. Now this is going to be a fairly general overview. I'm not going to go into too much detail into each specific ideology, but as you can see from the image I'm going to post on the screen, we're going to be delving into the more unknown areas and specifics of right-wing politics and how they relate to each other. So essentially what we're going to be doing is making a tree that branches out and seeing the kind of three major schools of thought within the right wing. Now just a quick note, the left-right divide is a relatively modern concept of politics. It came out of sort of the French Revolutionary period, and it's not always 100% accurate. If you're unfamiliar with politics, if you're new to politics, this might not be the video for you. You might start off looking at a left-right divide that focuses only on authoritarian versus libertarian, more government, less government. So that would be a better place to start. But for all of those people out there who are either right-wing now or are curious about the right wing or who want more information on specific ideologies, let's go ahead and get started with that. So here's the infographic that I've made. It's pretty decent. I don't think everything is as perfect as it could be, and there are a lot of fringe or lesser known ideologies that I had to kind of cut out just to save space. But essentially, in right-wing thought, there are three pillars. You have authority, you have hierarchy, and you have property. So this is represented by the Italian fasces, a king's crown, and the anarcho-capitalist flag. And the bold, if you look towards the center here, you can see the bold letters are essentially the basis of the what most people would call the fringe right, the kind of outside right. But I'll go into all of this. So let's start at the very bottom in the center. This is what you would consider the very center of the political spectrum. And as we go up, we hit the center right. A lot of people in the world today are center right but don't know it. These are typically apolitical people that hold some kind of social conservative values of some kind. It's sort of the semi-religious, but not really, kind of, they like going to church, they like moral values, but they don't really have a problem with, like gays getting married or something like that. That's kind of where we're at. And this is different from center-right politics in Europe. I think this is more of an American concept. But let's keep going. Up from that, we get to republicanism, and republicanism is generally a little bit more right-leaning than center-right. Of course, that's why it's further up on the tree, but they generally believe in economic conservatism, so spending less, generally against most forms of welfare, but not totally opposed. We have a general trend towards conservative moral values, although it's not explicitly hard line as of right now until you get further up the tree. And one interesting thing about this part is that neoliberalism, which is, I think it's a term that was kind of coined by Milton Friedman. It's sort of right-wing thinking. It's a rejection of Keynesianism. It's more of a split in the freedom section here on the right with libertarianism, but it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly where it is. And a lot of American Democrats fall under the neoliberalist position, or you could also put it under the corporatist umbrella as well. But I'm not going to cover that. Neoliberalism, it's as far as I'm concerned, it's trash, so I've just left it off to the side. Now, as we go up one more level, we get into this blue square. Now, this blue square is what most people would consider the alt-light. And what this is essentially less mainstream right-wing politics. Not, completely esoteric, but slightly less mainstream. And we start off with populism. Now, of course, populism is a right-wing ideology that holds, social conservatism and economic conservatism, but it is an explicit rejection of the mainstream. It's anti-elitism, essentially. And this is essentially what Donald Trump is. Donald Trump ran on the ticket of conservatism with an anti-elitist spin. That's why people called him a populist. So then we go up one more time, and we're going to hit something called New Conservatism. And most people don't know it by this name, but New Conservatism is a little bit more strict as far as immigration and welfare and spending, and it's typically less interventionist than what you would consider a typical American neoconservative. It's a new wave of, you could almost call it natalism or some type of pro us, although they don't define what us is. It's strong in-group preference with a focus on more social conservatism and more economic conservatism. When you get to new conservatism, you're looking and focusing more on the natural order of things, natural law, traditionalism. You could almost call it traditional conservatism. Now, as we move up one more, we get into paleoconservatism, which is very much natalist, very strong on keeping immigrants out, and very socially conservative. We're starting to get into almost into theocracy. We're getting into the point where there is a lot of moral legislature going on, banning abortion and not allowing gays to get married, and generally things like this. But let's pull back a little bit and let's split off to the right side of the political spectrum. And so from republicanism, there is another path you can take if you don't go the populist route, and you can head towards constitutionalism. Now, this is the generally the 1776 will commence again type people, the Alex Jones, the people who fly Gadsden flags, that kind of thing. It's constitutionalism. They believe in a constitution, and this is actually pretty popular in America. They're very pro-American Constitution. They want to return to the roots of the government, a small government essentially. And this branching, when you get to constitutionalism, you're getting into the sort of libertarian right, the freedom right side. And I'll explain more about that as we go up. And so then we get to minarchism. Minarchism is just the next step up from constitutionalism, where they want to minimize the government as much as possible. They still believe in a social order, a social hierarchy. They still very much in favor of individual property rights and the moral essentialism that is property ownership, which is what separates this from the left wing, I would say. And as you get less and less minarchist, you become more of a mainstream libertarian, which is we would agree that we should lower the size of the government, but ultimately that's not as effective as completely removing the government in and of itself. So there's a lot of, the libertarian movement is fairly popular. It's still within this alt-light movement. But as we go from libertarianism, we split off in two ways. You can either go towards anarcho-capitalism or right libertarian. And the difference is your social conservatism. If you are a social conservative and you believe in liberty and freedom and all of those things, you become a right libertarian. So right libertarians like Rothbard and Hoppe, they have this idea that we can have these social norms, the social conservative moral norms, not enforced through the state, such as like a paleocon would do or a theocrat would do, but we can do it socially. So we don't interact with or encourage people in our society to act a certain way, to not be degenerates, but we're not going to use the state to enforce our morals on people. There's a lot more in right libertarianism. You get into the realm, as you can see by the orange line, we get into this realm of racial consciousness and collectivism is either common or required. So a lot of right libertarians are in the alt-right because they are racially conscious and they would enjoy it better if the races were segregated. It's still libertarian because they still want the government to be as small as possible or not exist at all. They are against the philosophical concept of the state, but they are very socially conservative and racially conscious. Now, on the opposite side, if you go to anarcho-capitalist, you're generally not going to talk on and on about the social issues. However, this is the extreme form of the acceptance of an absolute moral objectivism of private property. So you still think that private property is an essential part of human society, but we have completely abolished the state. So we have no government and very much a pro-capitalist society. But there's one more step above that some people don't know about, and this is a little bit more fringe than the other ones, and that's anarcho-nationalism. So you have these ANCAPs who essentially start to see the light when they talk to right libertarians. They see this sort of social order and hierarchy that the right libertarians talk about, and they say, yeah, that sounds right. That makes a lot of sense. I can see kind of the arguments and science behind it. And then they become anarcho-nationalists, where they are against the concept of the state. They're pro capitalist, but they also have high in-group preference. And this is why it puts them in the alt-right, because they are racially conscious and they are also racially collectivist in a lot of ways. I don't meet too many people who are anarcho-nationalists. It's kind of almost like tribalism, like neo-tribalism with capitalism sprinkled in here and there, but it's the logical conclusion of this school of right-wing thought. So you have you're calling into question the validity of the state, but you are still socially conservative. This is essentially what makes the right libertarian movement work. And if you take that to its extreme, if you reject any form of government, you become an anarcho-nationalist. So let's take it back to the paleo-cons. And if we look at paleo-conservatism and we move to the right, we hit theocracy. Now, theocracy is an interesting perspective because while it is common for there to be a racial consciousness within theocracy, it is not, I would say, a part of the alt-right, because there are lots of people in our society who are theocrats who would have the state be run by religious laws, this type of moral legislation. But not all of them are racially conscious or care about specifically racial collectivism. And this is coming from the Christian worldview, the type of we are all brothers in Christ sort of mentality. So it's outside the alt-right, but it can be racially conscious depending on who you're talking to. And like I said, theocracy is essentially government that's legislating religious laws. There's a state religion, so on and so forth. There can be state mandated church service and things like that. But as you go into the alt-right from theocracy, it very much becomes divine right monarchism. So I know it's kind of a leap. I know we're kind of leaping here, but if you take the reactionary route and you throw in theocracy, you become a divine right monarch. If you're already a theocrat and you believe that the state is ordained by God, the logical conclusion for a lot of people is a divine right monarch, this sort of vicar of God that controls and legislates the country. So now we're in the alt-right territory, so let's go back a little bit and let's go from paleo-conservative to reactionary. Now, reactionary is sort of a broad term. It doesn't specifically talk about right or left per se, but in our current society, reactionary means typically people who want to take our society politically and socially and religiously back in the past to how it once was, whether that's the 1950s or the 1800s or the 1600s or the thousands, whatever. They're reacting to what they believe is a degradation of society in the modern age. They completely reject liberalism and egalitarianism and equality and things like that, and we want to take it back to the old days. And reactionary is the jumping point for a lot of ancient traditions of human society. So we have, if you go off to the left, we have feudalism, which also can turn into aristocracy. And if we go back to reactionary, it can also become monarchism. It's the basis for monarchism because historically human societies have been led by a monarch of some kind. So within that, branching out from that, from a monarchy, you can go to an aristocracy, and then you can take that even further and you can enter the territory of a naturalistic aristocracy. And this is the idea that human society, through natural selection and evolution, the leaders of that society were the strongest, the smartest, the best looking, the whoever. They just happened to dominate society. And that genetic lineage becomes an aristocracy and rules over everybody else because they just happen to be the best. And if you take that, it doesn't necessarily have to be monarchical. You can have this sort of social order that in turn becomes sort of like a government structure. But most people, they understand aristocracy, they want an aristocracy, and then they also want some kind of monarchy as well on top of that. And there's several types of monarchism. I touched on divine right monarchism, where the king or queen is ordained by God, but there's also constitutional monarchism, wherein there is some kind of charter that is drafted by the people in order to maintain the powers or legitimacy of the king. And one step up from that, at least historically, is the sort of parliamentary monarchism, where there is a representative body of the monarch. There is a group of people who can legislate, but are still technically beneath the king. Now we get into the very fringe of the monarchist society. Not many people know about this, but if you take the naturalistic worldview from aristocracy and you take the sort of representative monarchism, I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but stay with me here for a sec. It becomes a naturalist representative monarchism, or monarchy, sorry. And this goes back to the sort of pre-Christian monarchies that were had in Europe. So there's an interesting book that was written in 1930s Germany, translated by the English, and it talks about the historical monarchies that existed in pre-Christian Germany. And it's very interesting that people had a sort of, I don't know if we would call it racial consciousness, but they had a group consciousness, and they said, we're going to pick the strongest, fastest, smartest person, and he's going to be the king, and then maybe if his descendants are worthy, they'll still get to be the king. So it's like you have this sort of safety net. If the king is bad, then you can just cut his head off and move on, and then elect the next one. It's sort of this like almost like natural selection and monarchy put together. It's also slightly different in that this type of monarch typically did not legislate. He simply enforced the rules of religion. And eventually when it became Christianity, before when the society was changing from this to divine right, there was this interim period where they believed that the king was not the one who set the rules, that God is the one that set the rules, and it was only the king's duty to enforce these divine rules. So it's a bit different than divine right monarchism. And it's more of a fringe. It's sort of the logical conclusion of monarchism if we go back historically. So in the final part of this right-wing politics exploration, let's go all the way back down to paleoconservatism, and let's go to the left, and we hit ethno-nationalism. And this is the idea that the primary focus of the state is the ethnic group, the racial group. It's extremely racially conscious. I mean, it's in the name in and of itself. And this branches off into what should be known as right-wing socialism. It's essentially, instead of socialism for everybody or socialism for the out-group, it's socialism for the in-group, for your race, so to speak. And because this is such a broad term, you cannot say that right-wing socialism equals national socialism, because it does not exactly equal it. It's not the same school of thought per se. There are different policies within the two that you can make. National socialism is a specific type of right-wing socialism, if that makes sense. But from right-wing socialism, we get two primary schools of thought, and that is National Socialism, which we all know what that is, and fascism, which nobody apparently knows what fascism is, so I'm going to read the definition so we can understand this. Fascism is a form of radical authoritarian nationalism, characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and control of industry and commerce. You could say that National Socialist Germany was a fascist state, although if you look specifically at the policies that they enacted and specifically the ideology, it's different than, let's say, Mussolini's Italy. So I believe you can separate these two. If someone says they are a fascist, you don't immediately think, okay, he's a National Socialist. No, you think he's a fascist. And if someone says they are a National Socialist, does not mean they are explicitly a fascist per se. It's a divide that you could say is maybe semantic, but I think that you can categorize them as two different things based on the type of policies that you would have in each one. So that concludes looking at the tree. Let's kind of recap exactly what right-wing politics are. And essentially, it comes down to the three words: authority, hierarchy, and property. So if you're a right-winger, you see the world in this lens of social orders and hierarchies are naturally occurring, they're inevitable, but they're also a positive force in progressing society positively. It's a sort of Darwinistic natural selection type of thing for your society. Those who are the very best and brightest will gain the most resources, they will be the most genetically successful, they will pass their offspring, and the entire collective, so to speak, increases over time, because only the strongest, smartest, whatever, are able to reproduce successfully. And those who do work hard or work the hardest, or those who are the smartest, will gather the most resources over time. Within right-wing politics, there is a consistent support of the sort of natural laws, that the world is governed by natural laws, and that it's positive for society to follow these natural laws. And this plays a part in not only the social order, but the economy as well. So it's sort of this free trade ideal. Now, not all of these right-wing schools of thought are absolute free trade of all different kinds, but generally speaking, it's not a left-wing version, which is more communal, egalitarian, every person essentially gets what they need as long as they put in some effort, that kind of thing. It's not exactly the same. As you get into right-wing socialism, it does kind of mix and match with that because it is a form of socialism, but the difference is the social hierarchy and the racial consciousness, because on the left side, they don't believe, they want to tear down social hierarchy and tear down racial consciousness. So that's why it's explicitly a right-wing ideology. So we're running on a little long here. If you made it this far, I'd like to say thanks for listening. If you want to see more like this, leave me a like, subscribe, that kind of thing. If you have any suggestions, or if you thought I got something wrong, please leave me a comment down below. I love to learn about stuff. And thanks for watching.